Your body is brilliant. Nature's Bounty has a bounty of solutions to help you thrive, supporting your systems from your head to your heels. Nature's Bounty High Absorption Magnesium Glycinate supports heart, bone, nerve, and muscle health, while just one hair growth capsule a day helps grow thicker, fuller hair. Delicious new Nature's Bounty Probiotic Gummies contain prebiotics and postbiotics, supporting gut health, regularity, and immune health. Nature's Bounty. It's in your nature. Learn more at naturesbounty.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
And welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. We're kind of taking, we've taken a bit of a break over the summer. It's been very nice and sunny down here, and I've been kind of a little burnt out from a long period of doing lots and lots of content. So I've taken a little break, but we're kind of back now. And I want to talk today about Vietnam, particularly Vietnam War reporting. And we're going to look at Philip Knightley and his book, The First Casualty. And I think we've looked at the book a couple of times before and looked at the way in which the Second World War was reported and other conflicts. But here, Vietnam is the first TV war. It's a war where embedded journalism becomes even more significant as a device as far as the kind of US foreign policy and defense establishment goes in building a consensus for the war, which actually holds together for a remarkably long period of time. In the first era, from 1954, the beginnings of America's involvement, up to 64, the landing of ground troops in South Vietnam are en masse, not just military advisors and Green Berets, but building up by 68 to 500,000 troops. During that period, 54 to 64, remarkably little is said about Vietnam in the American press. Most American readers of newspapers and watchers of TV shows, it's not that they don't know where Vietnam is, or these kind of popular kind of sort of digs at America. They have very uninformed population, and I think the population of most Western countries, when you're asked to point to what their military is doing and where it's doing it on a map, find it difficult. So there's nothing exceptional about America in that regard. But it's not that people didn't know any basic facts about Vietnam. It's that they were reporting that America had involvement in Vietnam was very, very kind of slender and minimal. And this is because for that 10-year period, most of what's happening is covert. There is a great bit in Julia Lovell's book, Maoism, A Global History, where she points out that the Cold War in Asia, the Vietnam War has less to do with the Soviet Union and more to do with the containment of China. And for American military planners, China is much more alarming than the Soviet Union is. It's less predictable. It's less clear what Mao intends, other than his rhetoric of worldwide revolution, but it looks more exportable. And the great worry of American foreign policy hawks in the 1960s was national liberation movements. Places like Vietnam that were deciding what they wanted to do with their resources, with their population, and there was the threat of a good example spreading out throughout the global South. This is what you've got to stop. And Mao's rhetoric was very much about global peasant revolution. It just so happens that the Vietnamese communists in the north are very suspicious of Mao, very wary of Mao, and they fall out with him as well. But the rationale for Kennedy later saying Vietnam is the place. Here's where we have to draw the line and wage the war, and we must be kind of unflinching in that, is because it is how you contain Maoist China. Had they done a little bit more research on the long-standing, centuries-long enmity between China and Vietnam, they might have chosen to actually back the Ho Chi Minh regime. It would have been far more sensible. So Philip Knightley writes, at the end of the Second World War, in order to help rehabilitate the Western alliance, the United States decided to support France in her efforts to cling to her former colonies in Indochina. By 1950, with the rise of Mao Zedong in China and the outbreak of the Korean War, in Washington's eyes, this had turned the Cold War into a global ideological struggle. In 1954, following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam was divided between a communist north under Ho Chi Minh and a non-communist south under President Ngo Dinh. The United States, as part of its policy of containing China, supported Diem, and the first 200 military advisors left for South Vietnam. This act was to cause the United States to be inexorably drawn into the most traumatic war in its history. However, the events of Vietnam that followed the arrival of the advisors received only modest attention in the American press. There are few experts on the area, and most articles in the period from 1954 to 60 concentrated on the communist menace and the need for greater American involvement. Battered and shunted about by the war, wrote Leo Chern in Look magazine on January the 25th, 1955, the South Vietnamese are too wary to resist the Reds without us. Diem, later to be recognized as one of the most corrupt leaders in Asia, was hailed by Newsweek as one of the ablest leaders, Asia's ablest leaders, and by Time as doughty little Diem. Well, Newsweek and Time, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, no doubt, have had a long track record of presenting strongmen, despots, and general crooks as being these sort of rather noble, valiant figures, and it's ultimately whatever the American defense establishment thinks is appropriate to print, and will kind of give them a nudge in the right direction. So sort of preposterous publications, really. It was only after the revolt of army paratroopers in Saigon in November 1960, when some 400 civilians were killed before the rebels were overcome, that the American press showed the first signs of interest in what was really going on in Vietnam. The New York Times sent out a veteran war correspondent, Homer Bigart, formerly of the Herald Tribune, who joined a tiny corps of full-time reporters in Saigon. The others were Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press, Ray Herndon of the UPI, Nicholas Turner of Reuters, and Pierre Chauvet of Agence France Presse. Time had Jim Wilde as a stringer, a part-time correspondent, and Francois Sully as a Frenchman who'd been living in Vietnam for 13 years, who was a stringer for Newsweek. No British daily newspaper had a full-time correspondent there at this stage. A major story would bring in correspondents like Richard Hughes of the Sunday Times, Frank Robertson of the Daily Telegraph, Dennis Bloodworth of The Observer, Dennis Warner, who'd represented various Australian and American newspapers, and other special correspondents from Tokyo, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Singapore, and even as far as Melbourne. But to the discredit of the world's press, the fact remained that in the crucial years of Diem's decline, Diem's assassinated in 1963, with American involvement growing steadily, the only daily newspaper with a full-time correspondent in Saigon was the New York Times. The rest relied for their day-by-day coverage on the 4 news agency men. These correspondents had a difficult task. To begin with, they were accredited by the Diem government, which saw no reason why it should allow foreign correspondents to write stories critical of its performance. If the correspondents did so, the Diem regime called them spies and communists and did its best to censor their copy, and by intimidation prevent them from repeating the offence. The United States Military Assistance Group was desperately trying to conceal the full extent of American participation in the war against the Viet Cong, and tried to make the correspondents accomplices in this deception. This is a long-standing thing of the embedded journalist being either complicit or utterly outclassed by the sort of the spooks and the military advisors that handle them, and it becomes very difficult for the journalist to get to see exactly what they're not allowed to see. And they have to be, occasionally they get one past their military handlers, but a lot of the time, in the mess clubs and bars of places like Saigon, it becomes very easy for journalists who become ground down and jaded, who are a bit like that to start with, to simply comply with what they've been told, and then they get to see some interesting stuff and go up in helicopters and get to be able to take pictures of things. And having done in my journalistic days in Kosovo a long time ago, being essentially an embedded reporter, I can tell you, when the army wants you to get somewhere, you can get there. There's normally a helicopter to get you somewhere. And when they don't really want you to go somewhere, well, you can't. So the embedded reporter is like the flea on the dog. They really, really are. The correspondents were depressed about it. We seem to be regarded by the American missions as tools of our foreign policy, wrote Homer Bigart in the New York Times House magazine. Those who balk are apt to find it a bit lonely, for they are likely to be distrusted and shunned by American and Vietnam officials. Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press decided to put his experiences on public record. He sent in a dispatch complaining that the United States officials had concealed from correspondents the extent to which American servicemen were performing combat duties. And his story appeared among other newspapers, the New York Times on March 24th, 1962. Diem's government reacted swiftly. At that stage, it did not move against Brown. Instead, it issued expulsion orders against Sully, the Newsweek stringer, because of his stories about Diem's corruption and ineptness, and against Bigart for the general tone of his reporting, and in particular for a story he had written about the members of a Michigan State University group who had expressed disgust at the corruption they had encountered. The expulsion orders were withdrawn when the State Department, alarmed at the uproar that seemed likely to result, put pressure on the United States mission in Saigon, which in turn put pressure on Diem. But clearly matters could not go on like this. So the State Department arranged for John Mecklin, Time Bureau's chief in San Francisco, to have leave for government service, and sent him to Saigon to straighten out the press problem, or the press mess, as it was known in the mission. So obviously at this time, later on in 1970, it could be 71, I forget, maybe it's 71, I think, when the Pentagon papers are released. These are the papers that were compiled over the years by McNamara for both Kennedy and Johnson, which showed that Vietnam was unwinnable. And they'd known this right from the get-go. A lot of the information that maybe the press corps knew and it was suppressed or they couldn't prove, came out in the Pentagon papers, and a lot of the information that should, ideally have been made available, which might have put pressure on American presidents to either disengage from Vietnam, was sat upon, and only through the efforts of the economist Daniel Ellsberg do they finally see the light of day. Coming back to Mecklin had an unenviable job. The basic difficulty was that the mission in Saigon had to keep to the line being given out by Washington, namely that American advisors were only advisors, and that the United States was not actively involved in the war, and that Diem, although a little shaky in his interpretation of democracy, was coming along fine. So it's amazing how these things, they just get recycled and recycled and recycled and recycled and recycled. That there's a version of Diem and a version of the advisor's story happening almost in every continent on Earth, in every decade that follows the Vietnam War. There are too many to list right here, but honestly, if you want some examples, drop me a line. I'll be happy to supply them. But it's also interesting that the CIA and the State Department are able to recycle all these untruths with impunity, knowing probably that everybody knows exactly exactly what's really happening when you place figures, the DMs of the world in charge. That their shaky interpretation of democracy isn't just that they've not really understood our sophisticated Western ways. These are kind of local gangsters who have been selected for one reason and one reason only, and it's the zeal of their anti-communist faith and nothing more. And are now able to access large undisclosed sums of funds.
This back to school, hear your teen say something you never thought possible.
Thanks, Ma.
Come to your Boost store and take home iPhone 15 with its amazing camera and all-day battery for only $99.99. Perfect for back to school.
Thanks, Ma.
You won't get tired of hearing it. Visit your nearest Boost store. Requires ID verification, port in and activation on $60 per month plan and $35 device setup fee. Taxes extra.
So although members of the mission knew the truth about the United States involvement and about the real nature of the Diem regime, writes Philip Knightley, they had to lie to the correspondents. They did not tell the really big falsehoods, Mecklin said, but only endless little ones. But the correspondents knew they were being told lies and were given to storming into offices of the United States Information Service to make it clear that they knew. The only way out for American officials was to claim that this deception on the American public was necessary, that the communists had to be stopped, and the United States had to put all of its chips on Diem, and to appeal to the correspondents' patriotism not to damage the national interest. This appeal failed. The American military authorities were bewildered. Correspondents had been patriotic in the Second World War. They'd been on side in Korea. What was wrong in Vietnam? So you're Brown, said Admiral Harry D. Felt, meeting the Associated Press man at a press conference in Saigon. Why don't you get on the team? Mecklin was bitter. In Vietnam, he wrote, in his book Mission in Torment, a major American policy was wrecked, in part by unadorned reporting of what was going on. So it was clear that American correspondents were doing their best during this period to inform their readers of the true situation in Vietnam. Unfortunately, they were not as successful as they could have been. In the early years of American involvement, the administration misled Washington correspondents to such an extent that many an editor, unable to reconcile what his man in Saigon was reporting with what his man in Washington told him, preferred to use the official version. John Shaw, a Time correspondent in Vietnam, now Times bureau chief in Moscow, well, this book is 40 years old, says, for years, the press corps in Vietnam was undermined by the White House and the Pentagon. Many American editors ignored what their correspondents in Vietnam were telling them in favor of the Washington version, yet the Pentagon papers proved to the hilt that what the correspondents in Saigon had been saying was true. So the relevance of the Pentagon papers again. Perhaps the editors and the Washington correspondents can be excused on the grounds that President Kennedy's administration itself did everything in its power to ensure that the existence of a real war in Vietnam was kept from the American people, as witnessed the notorious cable 1006 from the State Department to its information service in Saigon. This cable warned against providing transport for correspondents on military missions that might result in the correspondents producing undesirable stories, and it ordered that they be told that any criticism of Diem's regime would make it difficult for the United States to maintain friendly relations with the South Vietnamese government. Assistant Secretary of State Robert Manning went to Vietnam for an on-the-spot survey of the press situation to try to do something, as he reported, about the long-standing desire for the United States government to see the American involvement minimized, even represented as something less than in reality it was. The little corps of correspondents was not cooperative. The smallness of the group and their vulnerability made them stick together, so that as official stories became closed to them, they could cooperate in pooling what information they could gather. The war was still leisurely, almost an unreal one. Something like the phony war period in Europe in 1939 to 40. The correspondents could take a taxi from Saigon in the morning, drive down Route 4 to the Mekong Delta, lunch at a riverbank French seafood restaurant on 4 courses and 3 wines, go on to discuss the military situation with a South Vietnamese army officer, and be back in Saigon before dusk, after the dark roads belonged to the Viet Cong. The groups of full-time correspondents were still so small in 1963 that when they met for lunch on most days at Brodards in Tudeau Street, they were comfortably accommodated at one table. I mean, it has sort of echoes of Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American. This period where it's war, but it doesn't feel like it. But interest in Vietnam began to grow. British correspondents, hampered by none of the political difficulties that beset their American colleagues, began to sense the real story there. Richard Hughes wrote bluntly in the Sunday Times as early as March 1962 that the United States military intervention in South Vietnam had already passed the point where aid can be distinguished from involvement. And the following week, Nicholas Turner of Reuters spelled out just what this involvement meant, catching Washington out in a direct lie. The official United States position has been that American forces are not taking part in combat missions in South Vietnam except where their role as advisors brings them under fire, Turner wrote. A Vietnamese communique last Sunday said that about 60 communist guerrillas were killed by attacks by the Vietnamese Air Force. In fact, careful checking shows that only the co-pilots were Vietnamese. The pilots were Americans. While American newspapers were describing Operation Sunrise as a trial resettlement program, Bruce Rothwell of the Daily Mail, of all publications, wrote that whole villages were being burnt down and thousands of peasants forcibly resettled in camps, which had a minimum of barbed wire to avoid the concentration camp atmosphere. When the United States Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was quoted in America as saying that he was tremendously encouraged by what he'd seen in Vietnam, Dennis Warner, writing in the Daily Telegraph, that the Viet Cong dominated 3/5 of the land area and about 1/3 of the population. Dennis Bloodworth of the Observer forecast the failure of the Strategic Hamlet operation and was sceptical about the possibility of defeating the Viet Cong. In the Times of London, John White explained one reason why the American army was not averse to further involvement in Vietnam. South Vietnam is the only part of the world where the Pentagon's training manuals can be put to the test under conditions of real warfare. In this tropical Salisbury Plain is where the British Army drives its tanks around. New techniques are being developed in the area of counterinsurgency.
How can I help you today?
Hey, I need to talk about my loan.
No problem.
So I got the email. Sandy Spring Bank is becoming...
Atlantic Union Bank. That's right.
And will you still be...
Your banker? Of course.
More branches and ATMs?
Way more.
Still community-driven?
Still live here, still give here.
Mobile app?
Easy. Everything right at your fingertips.
And what about my business?
Always here to help you reach your goals.
Sandy Spring Bank is becoming Atlantic Union Bank, October 2025. Same bankers you love with even more to offer.
And that in itself tells you a huge amount. There's a great podcast I did last year, I think, Al, on Algeria as a laboratory for counterinsurgency, and the French counterinsurgents commandos were happy to tell the British and the Americans and other allies, probably the Israelis and others, exactly what they learned. Anyway, let's finish there, and I hope you found that interesting. And yeah, we've got some fascinating insights into Plato of all people tomorrow. Take good care. All the best. Bye-bye.
The key to good skin is hidden deep in the ocean. Osea's Undaria algae body oil harnesses the powers of Undaria seaweed for silky, soft, and glowing skin. Clinically shown to instantly improve skin elasticity, Osea's Undaria algae body oil isn't your typical body oil. Get 10% off your first order with code SEAWEED10 at OSEAMalibu.com. Plus, free samples with every order and free shipping on orders over $50.
Businesses that are selling through the roof, like Untuck It, make selling and for shoppers buying simple with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And with Shop Pay, you can boost conversions up to 50%. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Untuck It uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcastfree. All lowercase. Go to shopify.com/podcastfree to upgrade your selling today.